Every single night before you go to sleep, you lock your front door. You check the windows. You make sure you're safe from the outside world. But what do you do when the person you need protection from is already inside? What do you do when the person trying to kill you is the reflection staring back at you in the mirror? This is the story of Julian, a 21-year-old college student who found a diary hidden inside the wall of his new apartment. A diary written in his own handwriting, detailing events he had no memory of surviving. And on the very last page, a warning that would change his life forever. Don't fall asleep tonight. I'm tired of sharing this body. Julian was the kind of guy who faded into the background. He was an architecture student, quiet, painfully introverted, and constantly exhausted from pulling all-nighters. To save money, he rented a dirt-cheap studio apartment in a historic building downtown. The landlord told him the previous tenant had left abruptly, leaving all their furniture behind. Julian didn't care about the history. He just needed a quiet place to study. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. But then, the atmosphere in the apartment began to shift. It started with a heavy, suffocating feeling every time he crossed the threshold. No matter how high he turned up the heat, the air inside always felt ice cold. Then came the physical anomalies. Julian would wake up with small geometric scratches on his forearms. He assumed he was just scratching himself in his sleep due to stress. But then he started finding his things misplaced. His drafting pens would be lined up in perfect obsessive rows on the floor. His alarm clock would be unplugged. One evening, while trying to retrieve a dropped pencil that had rolled beneath the old baseboard heater, Julian noticed a loose wooden panel near the floor. He pried it open, expecting to find dust or old pipes. Instead, his fingers brushed against cold leather. It was a black, unbranded journal. Julian flipped it open, expecting to find the notes of the previous tenant. Instead, his heart stopped. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his. The distinct, jagged slant of his cursive, the way he crossed his T's with a long, aggressive stroke. He began to read. The first entry was dated exactly 2 years ago, a time when Julian was still living with his parents in a completely different city. The entry read, "He thinks he's in control because he gets the daylight. He thinks he's the real one just because he goes to class and talks to people. But the night belongs to me. I watch him through the back of his mind. I feel his weakness. Soon, the daylight won't be enough to keep me out." Julian dropped the book, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It didn't make sense. He didn't have a history of sleepwalking, let alone a split personality. He convinced himself it was an incredibly elaborate, sick prank, pulled by someone who had broken into his room and copied his handwriting. To prove it to himself, Julian bought a digital night vision camera and mounted it on top of his wardrobe, facing his bed. He went to sleep that night determined to catch the intruder. When he woke up the next morning, the apartment was dead silent. He climbed up, retrieved the camera, and loaded the footage onto his laptop. He skipped through the hours of him sleeping peacefully. Nothing happened. No one broke in. But at exactly 2:14 a.m., the footage glitched. The screen filled with static for 3 seconds. When the picture cleared, the bed was empty. Julian's eyes widened. He scanned the frame of the video. The camera was pointing at the bed, but in the far corner of the lens, reflecting in the dark glass of the window, he saw a silhouette. It was him. He was standing perfectly still in the corner of the room, staring directly up at the hidden camera. In the video, Julian's body slowly raised its hand, holding a pair of heavy drafting scissors. He wasn't sleepwalking. His movements were fluid, deliberate, and predatory. He took the scissors and slowly began to scrape them against his own forearm, carving a perfect, clean triangle into his skin. Real-world Julian looked down at his arm. Beneath his sleeve, a fresh, raw, triangular scratch was weeping blood. The video version of Julian walked back to the bed, lay down, and instantly went limp, returning to a normal sleep state. Julian was paralyzed with fear. He realized the diary wasn't a prank. It was a logbook, written by a secondary consciousness that lived inside his own brain, an entity that took over the moment his conscious mind drifted off to sleep. Desperate for answers, he picked the journal back up and forced himself to read through the frantic entries. The entity called itself the editor. It claimed that Julian's mind was nothing more than a poorly written draft, and its job was to cut out the unnecessary pieces. As Julian read further, the entries became more violent. The editor wasn't just walking around the apartment anymore. He was going outside. He was tracking people. An entry from 3 nights prior read, "Met the girl from apartment 3B in the hallway at 3:11 a.m. She asked if I was okay because my eyes looked different. She's observant, dangerous. I'll have to fix her first." Julian's blood turned to ice. Maya lived in 3B. She was a sweet, quiet girl who always helped him carry his groceries. He bolted out of his apartment and ran down the stairs to the 3rd floor. He banged on the door of 3B. No answer. He knocked harder, his panic spiraling out of control. The heavy door slowly creaked open under the pressure of his hand. It hadn't been latched. Julian stepped into the dark apartment. The air smelled metallic. He turned on the light switch, and a scream caught in his throat. The apartment was completely empty of life, but the walls were covered in hundreds of geometric shapes drawn in dark black ink. And in the center of the living room floor, Maya's phone lay shattered into pieces, surrounded by a pool of dried, dark fluid. Beside the phone was a note written in Julian's handwriting. "One piece cut. Julian is next." Julian ran back up to his apartment, locking the door and sliding the heavy dresser against it. He was completely trapped. If he stayed awake, he was safe. But the human body can only go so long without sleep. Micro-sleeps would eventually take over. The moment he blinked for too long, the editor would win. He checked the time. It was 9 p.m. The exhaustion from his architecture studies was hitting him like a physical weight. His eyelids felt like lead. He ran into the bathroom and splashed freezing water on his face. He looked into the mirror, desperate to see his own eyes. But as he stared at his reflection, the image didn't blink when he did. The reflection's eyes stayed wide, locked onto Julian's. A slow, terrifyingly familiar smile crept across the reflection's face, even though Julian's actual lips were pressed into a tight, trembling line. "You look tired, Julian," a voice echoed, not from the room, but from inside his own ears. It was his own voice, but deeper, smoother, devoid of any human empathy. Julian stumbled backward out of the bathroom, tripping over his desk chair. He grabbed a bottle of caffeine pills from his desk and swallowed 3 of them dry. He had to survive the night. He had to make it to daylight, find help, go to a hospital, anything to get this thing out of his head. By 3 a.m., the caffeine pills were failing. The room began to warp and stretch. The shadows on the wall seemed to reach out for him. Julian's phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number. He picked it up with a shaking hand. The text message was just a video file. He pressed play. The video was a live stream from the camera mounted on his wardrobe. Julian looked up at the camera in real life, then looked back down at the phone screen. On the phone screen, he could see himself sitting at the desk, looking at his phone. But standing directly behind his chair, completely invisible to Julian in the real room, was a dark, shadowy figure, wrapping its hands around his neck. Julian gasped, spinning around. There was nothing there, just empty air. But when he looked back at the phone, the figure on the screen was leaning down, whispering directly into his ear. "I'm not waiting for you to sleep anymore," the voice whispered in his head. "I'm pulling you under." Julian felt his knees buckle. A wave of artificial, overwhelming sleepiness washed over him, far heavier than normal exhaustion. It felt like an anesthetic pouring through his veins. He fought it, biting his own lip until it bled, trying to use the pain to stay awake. But the darkness was too heavy. He collapsed onto the floor, his vision narrowing into a tiny, suffocating pinpoint. His eyes closed. The room was dead silent for 10 minutes. The storm outside battered the windows with rain. Slowly, the body on the floor began to move. It didn't scramble or panic. It stood up with a smooth, terrifying elegance. The trembling was gone. The fear was gone. The body walked over to the mirror, looked at its reflection, and adjusted its collar. It smiled a perfect, chilling smile, He walked over to the desk, picked up the black leather journal, and opened it to a blank page. He picked up a pen and wrote in a neat, jagged cursive, "The draft has been corrected. Julian has been deleted. The morning belongs to me now." The body put the journal back into the secret wall panel, slid the wood shut, and walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind him as he stepped out into the daylight.